I bought three side-by-side triplexes for $375,000. Today, they're worth $1 million. And I still regret how I did it. Here's triplex one, here's triplex two, here's triplex three. Same seller, same price, and I found all of them listed together on Redfin the very same day. Let me show you some befores and afters so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. Here's the before of the triplex one and two and three. And here's some afters of triplex one and two and three. Everyone told me that this was a home run, slam dunk deal. Financially, it was. But here's what a good deal actually looked like behind the scenes. So one day I was on Redfin looking at properties, scrolling, or maybe it's zooming in and out of Redfin, looking at different properties. And I found three listings side by side, $207,000 each. And when I looked at that, because that number was not a nice round number, I had a feeling this was a portfolio. So I reached out to the listing agent and found out that yes, it was the same seller listing three triplexes side by side. One of the triplexes also had an additional basement apartment, and that's what made it a 10-unit deal. The list price for each of these was $207,000, and the total was $621,000. Once we went to see the triplexes, we realized that there were many issues with it. Number one, a lot of the units did not have heat in them. It was the middle of winter. Also, some of the tenants had actually changed the locks themselves, and the owner didn't even have access to the units. The roof was about to cave in, lots of different issues. And we found out that the owner was 90 years old, trying to retire and wanting out of this business completely. And that explained why he had let go of the maintenance of these units for a long time. When we did a walkthrough with our contractor, we realized that it needed a lot of work. And so we offered $120,000 for each of the triplexes. But they rejected that because it was quite low compared to the list price. And that makes sense. However, months went by and none of these sold. It's because they were trying to sell each individual triplex to owner occupants. And owner occupants were going after FHA loans or conventional loans. And it's very hard to get those types of loans on distressed properties. The seller also didn't want to take the time and the effort that needed to move the tenants to a better unit. They were just kind of taking it as it comes and not really putting any effort into it. And so owner occupants would have very hard time getting a loan for this. So eventually they came back to us and they took our $125K per triplex offer. So we were able to buy all three triplexes, all 10 units for $375,000. To finance this, I went to our local hard money lender that we had used many times before, and we asked them if they would fund it. The hard money lender looked at the numbers. It was $375K purchase price plus an additional $250K of construction budget. And the lender said that they just couldn't fund this deal. It was too big for them. And so they recommended another lender to us. We went with this lender. They offered us a construction to permanent loan. So basically the lender would fund the acquisition and the construction of this project, and then they would also refinance us out and give us a cash out refi. The holding and the carrying costs for this were around $60,000, and we needed to come up with about $160K in cash as our part of the seed money to be able to close this deal. Prior to this project, I had actually done a primary residence BRRRR, and that gave me $160K of HELOC, and that's what we used to put as seed money into this project. So if you think about it, I actually didn't come up with any of my own money to do this entire $1 million deal. The appraised value after the renovation was around $1 million for this entire project. At the end of the project, I was able to recover all of my $160,000 original funds, and I was able to pay back the loans that I used to be able to acquire and renovate the property. Everything said and done, after the renovation, the rents of all of the units combined were around $12,000 per month. So if you think about it, I actually was starting and scaling a business to cross the six-figure revenue mark within just a few months time frame. Now let's talk about cash flow and profit. So the cash flow on this property is around $3,500 a month, and that is after removing the PITI, which is principal, interest, property taxes and insurance. After you remove that from the $12,000, plus take an additional 20% out for CapEx, OpEx, vacancy, all of that, then that left me with $3,500 per month. That's about $42,000 per year in profit. I do want to share here that if you want to compare this type of cash flow of $3,500 a month to your W-2, I would compare that to your take-home pay, because the taxes are largely shielded by depreciation on any of these properties. It took me a few hours a week to manage the acquisition and the construction process and the refi process. And then once all the units were rented out, it took me a few hours a week to manage this property. So now let's come to regrets. Let me break it up into the steps of the BRRRR process. So if you look at the first step, that's buy, right? So when I bought this property, I really didn't have any experience renovating multifamily properties. I had done 10 single family home BRRRRs and they were pretty successful. And when I moved over to this project, I went from 1 to doing 10 units at the same time. Now, for any of you who've ever handled any kind of project like this, it's a huge learning curve. It was a very steep learning curve. In hindsight, I would have acquired a duplex or a triplex first and tried this on something like that first before moving over to a 10 unit deal. So that's one of my regrets. I would have ideally done a smaller project that was an in-between step between a single family home and a 10 unit project before I moved over to this. This is one of the biggest things I also teach my students now is start small, start with a single family home, learn everything, build all your business systems, processes, teams, everything on a single family home, make all your mistakes, and then move over to the next step, which would be a duplex, triplex, quadplex, and then move over to larger deals. Now I do a 200 unit apartment building value add investment project, and I'm okay with that because I have built up to that. The next step is rehab. My biggest regret in this construction project, and out of all the different steps on this project, the construction project is where I had the most to learn, was that construction on a single family home is very different than construction on a 10 unit building. One of the biggest things I learned was working with my contractor and how his business works. So if you look at how contractors work, they spend their time, number one, fulfilling the business that they have already acquired. And the second thing that they do is they are looking for more business at the same time. When my contractor got such a big project, which he never had before, his first instinct was to go take a vacation. And so after I gave him the money to start the project, he left. He left his guys to do the work in the project and he left the country to go on vacation. And the biggest thing you want your contractor to do is be at the job site. And in the absence of the contractor, there was a lot of money flowing to his guys and they weren't actually accomplishing a lot. When my contractor came back, we found out that they had used up 2/3 of the construction budget on 1/3 of the project. And that's not a small amount, especially for someone like me. I don't come from money. And so what I had to do was have a very tough conversation with this contractor. His wife actually messaged me the day I was going to have this conversation with him that he was pacing for hours and he was very stressed that he had made this big mistake. During this conversation, him and I did work out a deal where we were going to split the difference of the overage. However, that meant that him and I had to come up with that money, which neither of us had. And so the way I came up with that was I sold one of the assets. So remember I told you how I had done 10 single family deals before I ever got to this. All of my single family deals had about 30% equity, which meant that at any time, if a project goes wrong, I was able to liquidate one of them and take those funds, that 30% equity. And that's how I was able to cover it. It wasn't really the best thing for me because there are a lot of tax implications when you sell a property. I also worked hard to build up to this and I didn't want to get rid of one of my assets, but also I got rid of one door and built 10 doors instead, so I made do with it. There was also contingency built into the construction project, so that also covered some of the cushion. And then he gave up some of his profitability to come up with his part of the funds. And that's how we basically made it all work. at the end of the day. In hindsight, I regret not keeping a better eye on this. For a project this big, you want your contractor to be on site at all times. You also want to have an unbiased boots on the ground person who can keep an eye on a project like this for you if you can't yourself be at the job site all the time, every single day. And that's what we teach people in the program. A lot of my students are out-of-state investors. And so one of the biggest things we give them is a standard operating procedure and a video training along with that. And so now if you ask any of my students who are in my mentorship program, they all know that the biggest thing that they can do to make sure as out-of-state investors that their renovation goes according to plan is have an unbiased boots on the ground person who has their eyes and ears on the property at all times. A few things we did do correctly on this project that helped us were we made sure that there was a contingency amount set in the construction, which gave us a little bit of a cushion. Second, we made sure that we built up to something like this. So I did have the 10 single family homes that had equity, so I could liquidate that and get the funds from that. And third, built a reputation in the market where I was able to be fully transparent with my lender and they were willing to work with me to figure out a solution. And lastly, I have much better ways to track the funds that go from me to the contractor and how they're being spent on the projects now after seeing this. The next step in the project is renting it out, also known as stabilizing. So in order to stabilize this asset, I was self-managing all these rentals and I was holding open houses. My open houses were held on Sunday mornings. And this is true about any business. You have to understand who your avatar is. So even as we run our coaching business or we run our marketing agency, we are always aware of what the avatar is that we are serving and what their needs are. You have to meet them where they're at. Sunday mornings, my open houses were empty because my avatar that I was serving was in church at that time. And so we changed the timing of the open house, but we lost some precious weeks in trying to get this rented out. So again, the biggest lesson learned, whether it's this business or any business, you have to understand what your avatar is like. The other thing was at the time when I was doing this project, I was using a free property management software. And over time, I realized as I started renting all those units out that I needed to move to a more robust property management tool. I moved over to Buildium while this property was in the process of being rented out. And it just added a lot of admin load to a business that was still taking off. There are some great property management tools on the market. At that time, we used Buildium, but there's also Appfolio if you have over a certain number of properties. There is Turbo Tenant, there is Rent Ready. There's also a great tool called REI Hub that allows you to keep bookkeeping super easy so you can do all the books yourself. So there are really great tools on the market right now that are paid, but they're worth every dollar. Now let me talk about financing. Something I'm really proud of is doing this entire deal with none of my own money and taking the proceeds from that HELOC to use as seed money and then being able to pay myself back and the lenders back when we refinanced it. That was brilliant. That really is something that I would call have your cake and eat it too and eat it again. I'm also really proud of the fact that I used a construction to permanent loan. So when we did get to the permanent financing, all that was already done. We closed on both the loans when we acquired the property. And all we needed to do was present them with the leases so that they knew that the properties were rented out and stabilized, and they were just able to switch us over to permanent financing. Something I do regret is not building a ceiling into my interest rates. So the loan that we got had a 5-year rate reset, which is very common in commercial loans. And what I didn't know at that time was that I could negotiate a ceiling on how high the rates could go as the interest rates changed. In my subsequent loans, in the projects I have done after that, I have negotiated a ceiling, but in that particular deal, I didn't. I also regret not maintaining enough reserves because that led to having to sell one of my properties to be able to cover the issues that we faced in this particular project. All in all, at the end of the day, I have a property that is worth $1 million. I have a $250,000 equity in this property. So if someday I decide to walk away and sell it, I could make that $250K. I only spent a few hours each week on building this entire deal, seeing the renovation through and in renting everything out and stabilizing the property. And so making $250K on a deal like this with a few hours of work each week, when I compare that to my corporate salary, I used to have to work 40, 60 hours a week to not even make $250K a year. So all in all, I still love this project. And the flaws and the regrets that I talked about, they're execution flaws that are not really anything wrong with the deal itself. And this property cash flows at $3,500 a month. So if I were to compare it to my W-2 income, I would compare this to my take-home income, not my income before taxes. The tax benefits are incredible, and this is just one pancake in my, I always say that, stack your assets like pancakes. So this is just like one pancake in the stack that I have of assets. The deal was never the problem. How I ran parts of it, that's what I would change. And that's exactly why I teach the version of this process that skips every mistake you just heard me make. I wanted to share this with you guys, so whatever part of the real estate investing and wealth building journey that you're on, you can learn from my mistakes and you don't have to make the same mistakes. I hope this video was helpful. Let me know in the comments what was the most helpful part of this video and what other questions can I answer for you. Hey guys, I'm not a CPA or a tax advisor. This is what I've learned from my own experience, not personalized tax advice. Talk to your own accountant before making a decision based on any of this. Thanks for tuning in. If you found today's conversation valuable, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We've got many practical strategies and inspiring stories to help you build lasting wealth through real estate. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you in the next episode.